Good evening, City Council. This is Anthony Miller, Special Districts Manager with the City of Oxnard Public Works Division, presenting adoption of resolution establishing a maintenance and funding policy for landscape maintenance districts for the City of Oxnard. Recommendation that the City Council adopt a resolution establishing a maintenance and funding policy for landscape maintenance districts managed by the City of Oxnard. Background. The Special Districts Division within the Public Works Department is responsible for the management of the city's bonded assessment districts, landscape maintenance districts, LMDs, community facilities districts, CFDs, maintenance assessment districts, MADs, and waterways assessment districts, WADs. Each of these types of districts is governed by different provisions of state law, which set forth the purposes for which the districts can be formed, basic administrative requirements, and the processes by which their assessments and special taxes can be levied. LMDs are formed under the provisions of the Landscape and Lighting Act of 1972, Streets and Highways Code Sections 22500, the 1972 Act, and must comply with specific management requirements unique to the 1972 Act. In order to provide ample opportunity for public comment on this process, staff sent mailers to property owners within all the LMDs listing upcoming Public Works and Transportation Committee meetings on the subject. On February 25th, staff introduced various concepts and draft policy text examples for the Public Works and Transportation Committee to discuss and provide feedback with recommendations. On March 25th, staff brought specific policy text examples back to the committee in order to capture their recommendations within the final policy document. Staff received input from the committee on a variety of questions. Much of the discussion was specifically focused on appropriate reserve levels, processes for the balloting of districts, the need for a policy document for staff to follow, specific reserve requirements and priorities. Additionally, there was public comment and committee discussion that focused primarily on the reason for the existence of LMDs, which is addressed at the beginning of the discussion section in this report. Discussion. After significant review by city staff and substantial effort to include direction from the Public Works and Transportation Committee, staff is recommending that City Council adopt via resolution a landscape maintenance district maintenance and funding policy. LMDs exist to provide a direct and special benefit to those who choose to purchase property within its boundaries. The additional level of landscaping, amenities, parks, lighting, and/or other authorized improvements within LMDs are above and beyond what is generally provided to residents through the typical planning and permitting of non-LMD developments. These pictures are examples of paseos, one in an LMD and one that is maintained by the general fund. This is an example of an LMD neighborhood entrance. And this is an example of an LMD or a non-LMD neighborhood entrance. Discussion. Many of the city's LMDs were formed prior to the passing of Proposition 218 in 1996. This means that in LMDs formed without an inflator, any future increases in operating expenses for items such as landscape services or utilities cannot be met unless they are able to reduce services or eliminate improvements within that district. This specifically means reducing or canceling services entirely in order to stay within the LMD's funding capacity. Put this in terms that may be more familiar. The highest assessed rates within the past 5 years have been broken into a monthly payment to show what an equivalent to a homeowners association payment would be with similar improvements. This information is shown in Table 1 within the staff report. The LMDs highlighted within Table 1 are specifically at risk for substantial swings in maintenance quality as they become unable to fund their improvements because of inflation and their capped pre-Prop 218 fixed rates. This is already happening in some LMDs where maintenance and operations expenses are exceeding the LMD's capacity to fund them. Districts that are classified as underfunded or deficient are indicated within Table 2 in the staff report and on the map included as Attachment 3 to the staff report. This information is not meant to determine any ideal assessment amount, but rather illustrate the scope and scale of the services provided in comparison to what the highest assessment amounts represent as a portion of each unit's property's total tax bill. Prior to the adoption of Prop 218, the City Council could, each year adopt increases to assessment rates without holding any sort of property owner election. The LMDs established prior to the adoption of Prop 218 were approved by the City Council without the concept of a maximum rate or an automatic inflation adjustment. Many of the city's landscape maintenance districts do not incorporate an automatic inflation adjustment. Pursuant to Prop 218, to change an LMD's maximum rate, the city must conduct an assessment mail ballot proceeding. The purpose of this policy is to give guidance to staff regarding how to manage the LMDs, many of which are not on a firm financial footing. Neither Prop 218 nor the 1972 Act require that a city conduct any sort of survey or resident outreach prior to preparing an engineer's report proposing an assessment or mailing notices and ballots to property owners. Although not required, it makes sense to do outreach or surveying prior to beginning the formally required process, as there are significant costs associated with preparing an engineer's report and conducting a mail ballot proceeding. Staff has dedicated a substantial portion within the policy specifying procedures for initiating surveying prior to commencing the steps required by state law for an increase. Discussion around Prop 218 processes primarily focused on how and when balloting could take place within a district. Staff incorporated the feedback received during the committee process and within Policy Section 5, Survey and Balloting, which sets specific guidelines for the following: a level that is considered to be of significant interest within an LMD for balloting, how balloting should be funded, the process should be followed when a district is found to not be able to fund its maintenance and operations, what happens if a ballot is not pursued, and what happens if a ballot fails. Policy specifically seeks to clarify LMD funding practices and procedures. Specifically, the policy clarifies when fund balance contributions may be used, defines different types of reliable reserve funds and what they can be used for, and minimum and maximum levels for reserve balances where the city has discretion. Staff sought to define processes by broadly outlining how the current process works, and then refined the policy based on the feedback received. Examples of the feedback and direction specifically when Section 4, Funding, include the following: guidelines for when districts may be eligible to receive a non-utility subsidy from the general fund, establishing an operating reserve floor for fully funded districts of 16.6% and a ceiling of 47.4% of their budgeted expenses, providing guidelines that underfunded districts may have operating reserve levels which fall below 16.6% of their budgeted expenses, and establishing a hierarchy of procedures for staff to follow when expected revenue requirements within an underfunded or deficient district exceed the district's maximum rate of assessment. The policy specifically outlines and identifies the city's reserve types allowed within LMDs under the Streets and Highways Code. Staff has defined assigned reserves, operating reserves, and project reserves, and a significant portion of the policy determines how those reserves can be funded. Operating reserves, which are explicitly allowed under Streets and Highways Code Section 22569, were singled out for specific attention and discussion with the committee, as these reserves are often a sensitive topic. Additionally, staff has defined and outlined the process for collecting reserve funds for specific improvements, i.e. the project reserves, and has identified them as separate funds from operating reserves to clearly delineate what funds are saved for, as allowed under the Streets and Highways Code. To ensure these reserve amounts were not burdensome on any single district, the committee recommended that the reserve targets be set at a lower percentage than the maximum allowed under Streets and Highways Code Section 22569. This also provides staff with substantial flexibility on how the city budgets for its LMDs. A lower operating reserve percentage can make budgeting for LMDs with capped levels easier, as less funds may be needed to set aside prior to budgeting for regular maintenance and operations. However, that can also be achieved by changing this reserve requirement to a goal, which is similar to how staff currently manages the LMDs that do not have the ability to fully fund their operating reserve. In addition to regular operating reserves, LMDs may also hold reserves for specifically identified improvements in accordance with Streets and Highways Code Section 22660. Project reserves, as staff define them within the policy, may be reserved for any item that will incur an expense that is, quote, greater than can conveniently be raised from a single annual assessment and shall be raised by an assessment levied and collected in installments over a period not to exceed 5 fiscal years. This distinction is important as it encourages the city to periodically review improvements within the LMDs and their ability to fund them. The inability to fund these improvements, even when expenses are spread across a 5-year window, may indicate a need for an LMD to be balloted. As reserves are extremely important to the operation of the LMDs, staff sought to ensure that districts may be unable to generate reserve funds, follow specific priorities prior to setting the funds aside for reserve use. To do this, staff has defined with an LMD considered to be underfunded, meaning they are unable to fund both their reserve balances and maintenance activities, or deficient, meaning that they are projected to be unable to fund their reserve balances, maintenance, and operations, and are projected to end the fiscal year with a fund balance deficit. These classifications are recommended by staff so that there is a clear delineation for LMDs that are at risk for service reductions or other extraordinary adjustments to ensure their continued operations. With valuable input from the Public Works and Transportation Committee, the final policy document includes specific guidelines for what staff should do in the event that a district falls into one of these categories. While the priority list is prescriptive, staff sought to match the direction of the committee as closely as possible and has included language to defer to more specific council direction given in the future. The items above generally outline the sections discussed most thoroughly during staff's creation of the fully defined LMD maintenance and funding policy. Adoption of the full policy as presented will provide staff with defined processes and procedures more specific than what is laid out within the Streets and Highways Code, while also providing a roadmap for situations where a district may need to abide by Prop 218 rules and regulations. Overall, this policy will enable a more efficient administration of the city's LMDs and ultimately will provide staff with concrete answers on how the LMDs are managed. Financial impact. There is no direct financial impact associated with this action. Questions?